The veterinarian's hands froze mid-injection, the euthanasia needle trembling inches from Thunder's massive neck. "Wait," she whispered, staring at the military tag hidden beneath matted fur. It wasn't just any bull scheduled to die in 23 minutes. It was a decorated war hero. The shelter coordinator dropped her clipboard, the metallic clatter echoing through the concrete corridor as dozens of animals fell silent. Outside, angry protesters chanted, "Justice for Billy," while news vans lined the street, their cameras capturing what they believed would be the execution of East Texas's most hated killer. Dorothy Mae Henderson pressed her weathered face against the chain-link fence, remembering her grandson's funeral 3 years ago. Another child lost too soon. Her arthritic fingers clutched a faded photograph of a smiling boy who would never grow up. "Stop the injection!" Jake Matthews burst through the shelter doors, his wheelchair skidding across wet concrete. Every instinct screamed this was wrong. Who was Thunder really? And why was a military working bull sentenced to die for a crime that made no sense? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Jake Matthews had seen enough death in Afghanistan to recognize when something precious was about to be lost forever. The 48-year-old veteran maneuvered his wheelchair through the crowded Millbrook County Animal Rescue Facility, his calloused hands gripping the wheels with the same intensity he'd once used to handle military equipment. The Texas summer heat pressed against the concrete walls like a living thing, making the air thick and difficult to breathe. Thunder stood in the far corner of the reinforced steel pen, his massive Brahman frame casting shadows that seemed to swallow the fluorescent light above. At 2,200 pounds of solid muscle, black hide marked with streaks of deep red-brown, he was a magnificent specimen that should have been grazing peacefully in open pastures. Instead, he'd become the most feared animal in East Texas, blamed for the death of 6-year-old Billy Morrison 6 months ago. Dorothy Mae Henderson clutched her worn leather purse against her chest as she watched through the fence. At 72, the retired schoolteacher had buried more dreams than most people ever dared to dream. Her husband, Harold, was gone 3 years now, her children scattered across the country like tumbleweeds, calling maybe once a month if she was lucky. The loneliness ate at her worse than the arthritis in her joints, and something about this gentle giant's plight reminded her of every abandoned soul she'd ever encountered. Dr. Sarah Chen, the facility's head veterinarian, stood frozen beside Thunder's pen, her medical degree from Texas A&M hanging heavy on her conscience. 38 years old and dedicated to saving lives, she'd never faced an execution order for an animal she believed was innocent. The county commissioners had been clear. Thunder represented a liability they couldn't afford. The Morrison family's lawsuit threatened to bankrupt the county, and public opinion demanded blood. The protesters outside grew louder as the appointed hour approached. "Justice for Billy," they chanted, their voices carrying across the parking lot where news crews from Dallas and Houston had set up their equipment. Social media had transformed Thunder into a symbol, either of dangerous animals that needed to be eliminated, or of society's rush to judgment without seeking truth. Jake had driven 2 hours from his small apartment in Tyler, following a story he'd seen on the evening news. Something about Thunder's description had nagged at him through a sleepless night filled with familiar nightmares. The bull's behavior, his apparent intelligence, the way he held himself, it all reminded Jake of another bovine companion from his military days, a partnership that had saved more lives than anyone would ever know. Thunder lifted his massive head as Jake approached, and their eyes met across the steel bars. In that moment something passed between them, a recognition deeper than words, a shared understanding of what it meant to be judged by actions taken out of context. The bull's amber eyes held intelligence, pain, and something that looked remarkably like hope. Outside, the clock on the courthouse tower chimed 11:30. 30 minutes remained. The county commissioner's gavel fell with the finality of a gunshot, sealing Thunder's fate. Motion carries. The animal will be humanely euthanized within 72 hours. Commissioner Patricia Wells's voice carried no emotion, but her hands trembled as she shuffled the papers before her. The overflow crowd erupted into a mixture of cheers and protests that echoed off the courthouse walls like thunder itself. Jake had witnessed the vote from the back of the room, his wheelchair positioned near the exit in case emotions boiled over. He'd seen enough mob mentality in war zones to recognize when reason had abandoned the building. The Morrison family sat in the front row, Billy's mother clutching a photograph of her son, her husband's jaw set in grim satisfaction. Behind them, Dot Henderson dabbed at her eyes with a tissue that had seen too much use already. 72 hours, Dr. Chen whispered to Jake as they filed out into the sweltering East Texas heat. That's all we have. The veterinarian's professional composure was cracking like dried mud. She'd performed euthanasias before, but always for suffering animals beyond help. Thunder wasn't suffering from disease or injury. He was condemned by circumstances he couldn't possibly understand. The drive back to the shelter took them past Millbrook Elementary, where a makeshift memorial for Billy Morrison had grown over the past 6 months. Teddy bears, flowers, and handwritten notes from children created a colorful shrine against the chain-link fence. "He was going to be a cowboy," read one message in crayon. "Angels don't hurt anymore," proclaimed another. Jake's throat tightened as he recognized the particular grief that follows a child's death, the kind that demands someone pay, regardless of guilt or innocence. At the shelter, Thunder stood motionless in his pen, his massive head lowered as if he understood the verdict. The other animals seemed to sense the somber mood. Even the usually vocal goats remained silent. Thunder hadn't eaten in 2 days, his hay untouched, his water barely disturbed. Dr. Chen had explained that large animals could sense their own mortality in ways that science couldn't fully explain. "Look at him," Dot said, her voice breaking as she approached the fence. "He knows, doesn't he? He knows they've given up on him." The elderly woman had spent most of her teacher's pension on gas money, driving back and forth to the shelter every day since the vote was announced. Her arthritic fingers wrapped around the chain link, and she began to hum an old hymn her grandmother had sung during the Dust Bowl days. Amazing Grace drifted across the pen, and Thunder's ears twitched at the sound. Jake positioned his wheelchair as close to the fence as possible. In Afghanistan, he'd learned to read the body language of working animals under extreme stress. Thunder wasn't displaying aggression or fear. He was exhibiting profound depression. His massive frame carried the weight of isolation, of being misunderstood, of facing death without understanding why. It was a look Jake recognized from his own mirror during the darkest days after his injury. "Tell me about Billy Morrison," Jake said to Dr. Chen as they watched Thunder. The veterinarian's face tightened with the pain of memory. "Sweetest little boy you ever saw. Loved animals, especially the big ones. His family had brought him to the spring carnival at the Caldwell Ranch. Dr. Caldwell was showing off his prize bulls, Thunder included. Billy somehow got past the barriers." The official story was simple enough. An aggressive bull had attacked an innocent child. Thunder had been found standing over Billy's body, blood on his horns, the boy's life already slipping away. Dr. Richard Caldwell, respected veterinarian and Thunder's owner at the time, had called it a tragic but predictable outcome. "Bulls are dangerous animals," he'd told the press. "This is why we have safety protocols." But Jake had spent enough time around military working animals to know that training created behaviors that looked like instinct to untrained eyes. Thunder's posture, his reactions to sudden movements, even the way he positioned himself in the pen, everything suggested extensive conditioning, not the kind that created killers, but the kind that created protectors. The financial reality was equally grim. Thunder's daily care cost the county $500, food, veterinary monitoring, facility security, and liability insurance. With the county budget already stretched thin, the commissioners saw only one solution. "We can't afford to maintain a dangerous animal indefinitely," Commissioner Wells had explained. "And we certainly can't risk another incident." As sunset painted the sky blood orange, Jake made a decision that would change everything. He pulled out his cell phone and dialed the county commissioner's office. "This is Jake Matthews. I want to discuss adopting Thunder." The silence on the other end of the line stretched longer than a Texas highway. "Mr. Matthews," came the cautious reply, "are you aware of this animal's history? The liability issues alone." But Jake was already forming a plan that would either save Thunder's life or destroy his own. Jake's hands shook as he held the faded military document, the words blurring through his tears. "Service record, Thunder, military working animal, serial number MW7734. Dr. Chen leaned over his shoulder in the shelter's cramped office, her breath catching as she read the details. 3 tours of duty in Afghanistan. 47 successful missions detecting improvised explosive devices, 2 commendations for saving human lives, a Purple Heart, equivalent for injuries sustained in the line of duty. "This can't be right," Dr. Chen whispered, but her voice carried the weight of dawning realization. "Thunder isn't just any bull, he's a war hero." The document showed deployment dates that overlapped with Jake's own service, though they'd apparently never crossed paths in the vast theater of operations. While Jake had worked with Major, his bovine partner Thunder had been assigned to a different unit, one that specialized in the most dangerous reconnaissance missions. Outside Thunder's pen, Dot Henderson had attracted a small crowd of curious onlookers. Word was spreading through social media faster than wildfire in drought season. #Thunder. The hero was trending alongside #JusticeForBilly, creating a digital battlefield that reflected the growing division in Millbrook County. "That bull saved American soldiers," Dot declared to anyone who would listen, her teacher's voice carrying the authority of decades spent commanding attention. "And we're fixing to kill him for something that don't make sense." The revelation sent shockwaves through the community that had so confidently condemned Thunder. At Millbrook Diner, the usual morning coffee crowd found themselves arguing over eggs and bacon about things they'd never considered. "If he's trained to protect people, how'd he end up killing that boy?" asked Meredith Foster, the bank president's wife. Old-timer Earl Hutchins spat tobacco juice into his cup and shook his head. "Military animals don't just snap. Something else happened out there." Jake's research into Thunder's post-military life revealed disturbing gaps. After completing his service, Thunder had been transferred to the Department of Defense's surplus program, a bureaucratic maze where retired military animals were supposed to be placed in appropriate civilian roles. Instead, records showed Thunder had been acquired by Dr. Richard Caldwell through a private purchase that skirted the edges of legal regulations. Dr. Caldwell's reaction to the military revelation was telling in its intensity. When reporters cornered him outside his veterinary clinic, his usual composed demeanor cracked like ice under pressure. "That animal's service record is irrelevant," he snapped, his face flushing red. "Military training doesn't erase dangerous instincts. If anything, it makes them more lethal." But his hands trembled as he spoke, and seasoned journalists noted the sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. The legal implications were staggering. Veterans' rights organizations began mobilizing, with calls flooding into county offices, demanding Thunder receive the same consideration given to human veterans. "This bull served his country with distinction," declared Amanda Rodriguez, president of the Texas Veterans Animal Alliance. He deserves better than execution based on circumstantial evidence. Social media exploded with photos of military working animals, creating a groundswell of support that reached far beyond East Texas. Thunder's behavior began to make sense through the lens of his training. His positioning in the pen, always with clear sight lines to entrances and exits, reflected tactical awareness. His apparent aggression toward strangers was actually protective positioning, the same instinct that had kept soldiers alive in hostile territory. When Jake approached wearing his veteran's cap, Thunder had immediately relaxed, recognizing a fellow service member. But the most disturbing revelation came when Jake discovered Thunder's specialized training. Unlike traditional bomb detection animals, Thunder had been part of an experimental program using cattle for reconnaissance in areas where dogs might appear suspicious. His size allowed him to carry sophisticated detection equipment, while his natural behavior patterns provided perfect camouflage for intelligence gathering. The program had been classified, which explained why no one had connected Thunder's service record to his current situation. The financial stakes escalated dramatically with the military connection. Federal regulations regarding the treatment of retired military working animals carried serious legal consequences for anyone who harmed them without proper cause. The county's insurance company was already backing away from coverage, and lawyers from Washington were making inquiries about Thunder's treatment. Young Tommy Caldwell appeared at the shelter fence just as news crews were setting up for the evening broadcast. The 9-year-old boy approached Thunder's pen with the fearless curiosity of childhood, ignoring his father's sharp calls from the parking lot. Thunder's reaction was immediate and profound. The massive bull lowered his head gently, allowing Tommy to touch his muzzle through the fence. The moment was captured by a dozen cameras and would later become the most shared image in the Thunder controversy. "He remembers me," Tommy whispered to Jake, his eyes wide with wonder and something that looked like relief. "He's not mean. He never was. But Dr." Caldwell's arrival shattered the moment. He grabbed Tommy's arm roughly, pulling the boy away with an urgency that seemed excessive even for a concerned parent. Thunder's reaction was immediate. He stepped forward, positioning himself between Dr. Caldwell and Tommy, a low rumble building in his massive chest. The crowd fell silent, witnesses to a dynamic they couldn't fully understand. Jake's military training kicked in as he observed the triangle of tension. Tommy reaching toward Thunder, Dr. Caldwell pulling him away, and Thunder's protective positioning. This wasn't random animal behavior. This was a trained protector responding to perceived threat. As father and son disappeared into the parking lot, Jake noticed something that made his blood run cold. Tommy's drawings, scattered on the ground where he'd dropped them, showed crude but unmistakable scenes. A large black figure standing between a small person and a menacing shadow. In a child's simple artwork, Thunder wasn't the monster. He was the guardian. The pieces of a larger puzzle were beginning to form, and Jake realized that Billy Morrison's death might not be the simple case of animal attack everyone believed. The truth was buried somewhere in the complex relationship between Dr. Caldwell, his son, and a military bull trained to protect the innocent at any cost. The bond between Jake and Thunder deepened with each passing day, defying every expectation the community had held about the killer bull. Jake's daily visits to the shelter became a ritual that drew curious onlookers and skeptical officials alike. Thunder would position himself at the front of his pen whenever Jake's wheelchair appeared, his massive head lowering in what could only be described as a greeting between old soldiers. Dr. Chen documented Thunder's transformation with the meticulous care of a scientist witnessing a miracle. His cortisol levels have dropped 40% since Jake started visiting, she explained to the growing crowd of reporters who had descended on Millbrook County. His appetite has returned, and he's showing behaviors consistent with psychological recovery from trauma. The veterinarian's voice carried the wonder of someone watching the impossible unfold before her eyes. Jake's own healing was equally remarkable, though he tried to hide it behind his gruff military demeanor. The nightmares that had plagued him for years, visions of Major's broken body after the IED explosion, began to fade as he spent time with Thunder. The massive bull seemed to understand when Jake's breathing became labored, when his hands shook with phantom memories. Thunder would press his enormous head against the fence, his presence a solid anchor to the present moment. The therapeutic connection wasn't lost on Dot Henderson, who had appointed herself unofficial guardian of both man and bull. "That bull's doing more for Jake's PTSD than all them fancy doctors in Houston," she observed, rocking in the lawn chair she'd taken to bringing to the shelter. Her arthritic fingers worked steadily on a quilt she was making, a project she claimed was for her granddaughter, but which featured distinctly bovine silhouettes in the pattern. The community's division over Thunder had evolved into something more complex than simple support or opposition. Daily protests still occurred, but they were increasingly matched by counter-demonstrations. Veterans from across Texas made pilgrimages to Millbrook County, some in uniform, others in wheelchairs, all united in their belief that Thunder deserved the same consideration given to human service members. The visual of wounded warriors defending a bull created powerful imagery that social media amplified into a national conversation. Tommy Caldwell's secret visits to the shelter became more frequent and more troubling to observe. The boy would arrive on his bicycle, park it at the fence, and spend hours talking to Thunder in whispers too quiet for adults to hear. His drawings, which he left scattered around Thunder's pen like offerings, grew more detailed and more disturbing. They showed consistent themes: a large black protector, a small vulnerable figure, and shadowy threats that seemed to loom from every corner. Dr. Caldwell's attempts to keep Tommy away from Thunder became increasingly desperate. He hired private security to patrol the shelter perimeter, citing safety concerns for his son. But Tommy was resourceful in the way only children can be, finding gaps in adult vigilance with the determination of someone seeking salvation. When Jake asked him why he kept coming back, Tommy's answer was simple and heartbreaking. "Thunder understands. He's scared too." The financial support for Thunder's care had grown beyond anyone's expectations. Online fundraising campaigns had raised over $50,000. With donations pouring in from military families, animal rights advocates, and people who simply believed in second chances. Dot had contributed her late husband's life insurance money, $25,000 that represented her entire financial security. Harold would have wanted it to go towards saving something worthwhile, she declared, though her voice wavered with the magnitude of the sacrifice. Jake's investigation into Thunder's past revealed increasingly troubling details about the bull's acquisition by Dr. Caldwell. Military surplus records showed irregularities in the purchase process, including falsified documents about Thunder's behavioral assessments. The bull had been rated as exceptional for civilian placement by military evaluators, contradicting Dr. Caldwell's later claims about inherent aggression. Former handlers from Thunder's unit, reached through veterans' networks, described him as the gentlest giant they'd ever worked with. The psychological profile that emerged was of an animal with extraordinary intelligence and emotional sensitivity. Thunder had been selected for military service not for aggression but for his ability to read human emotions and respond appropriately to commands even under extreme stress. His trainers described techniques that relied on positive reinforcement and mutual respect, methods that created deep bonds rather than fear-based compliance. Thunder's specialized training included skills that seemed almost supernatural to civilians but were standard for military working animals. He could detect changes in human stress levels through scent, recognize the difference between threatening and non-threatening approaches, and position himself to provide maximum protection for his charges. These abilities, misunderstood in civilian contexts, had likely contributed to the misinterpretation of his actions during Billy Morrison's death. The media attention brought both support and scrutiny that threatened to overwhelm the small community. National news crews competed for exclusive interviews, while social media influencers descended on Millbrook County like modern carpetbaggers seeking content. The #SaveThunder hashtag had generated millions of impressions, but #Justice for Billy maintained strong support from those who viewed the military revelation as irrelevant to the fundamental question of public safety. Jake's own social media presence, reluctantly established at Dot's insistence, became a window into the developing relationship between man and bull. His posts, written in the spare prose of a career soldier, documented small moments that revealed Thunder's character. The bull gently nudging a fallen bird back to its feet, his careful movements around smaller animals in adjacent pens, his apparent recognition of children versus adults. Each post generated thousands of shares and comments that ranged from supportive to vitriolic. The legal battles intensified as various organizations filed injunctions and appeals regarding Thunder's fate. Veterans advocacy groups argued for federal protection under military animal welfare statutes. Animal rights organizations cited evolving standards for cognitive assessment in large animals. The Morrison family's lawyers pushed for immediate execution, claiming that prolonged media attention was causing additional trauma to their clients. County officials found themselves caught between conflicting pressures that threatened to bankrupt the local government, regardless of the outcome. Dr. Chen's veterinary assessments became crucial evidence in the legal proceedings. Her detailed behavioral evaluations documented Thunder's responses to various stimuli, his interactions with different types of people, and his demonstrated intelligence. "This animal shows no signs of unpredictable aggression," she testified to a packed courthouse. "His responses are consistent with protective training, not predatory instinct." Her professional reputation lent credibility to claims that many had dismissed as sentimental anthropomorphizing. The relationship between Jake and Thunder deepened beyond mere companionship into something approaching partnership. Jake began bringing military-style equipment to test Thunder's retained training, not for spectacle, but to understand the bull's capabilities and limitations. Thunder's responses were immediate and precise, demonstrating muscle memory that had survived months of confinement and emotional trauma. He could still follow complex hand signals, respond to whispered commands, and position himself tactically in response to perceived threats. Tommy's drawings evolved to include more detailed depictions of his relationship with Thunder, and they began to tell a story that adults were only beginning to understand. The pictures showed progression over time, initial fear, growing trust, and ultimately a bond that transcended species. But they also revealed darker elements, shadowy figures that seemed to represent authority, barriers that separated protection from those who needed it, and recurring themes of isolation and misunderstanding. The community's transformation was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the unfolding story. People who had never questioned the official narrative of Billy Morrison's death began to examine their assumptions. The simple story of a dangerous animal attacking an innocent child had given way to complex questions about trauma, training, and the rush to judgment that characterizes modern media culture. Coffee shop conversations that had once focused on condemnation now grappled with themes of redemption and second chances. Dot's unofficial support network had grown into a formidable organization that she ran from her trailer with the efficiency of a military operation. The Ladies for Thunder had evolved into a diverse coalition that included veterans, teachers, retirees, and working mothers united by belief in the fundamental goodness they saw in both Jake and Thunder. Their fundraising efforts had expanded beyond Thunder's immediate needs to support other misunderstood animals and struggling veterans throughout East Texas. As the days passed and Thunder's execution date approached, the intensity of emotions on all sides reached a fever pitch that seemed unsustainable. Something would have to break. Either the legal system would find a way forward, or the community would tear itself apart over the fate of a bull who had become a symbol of everything people believed about justice, mercy, and the value of lives deemed expendable by those in power. The hurricane warning came at the worst possible time, just 18 hours before Thunder's scheduled execution. Hurricane Delilah, a massive Category 2 storm, was barreling toward the Texas coast with sustained winds of 110 miles per hour and a storm surge that threatened to flood everything within 50 miles of the Gulf. Emergency management officials ordered immediate evacuations for all coastal and low-lying areas, including Millbrook County. The evacuation order created an impossible situation for Thunder. At 2,200 pounds, he was too large and supposedly too dangerous for standard livestock transport during an emergency. The county's animal control vehicles weren't equipped to handle a bull of his size, and private livestock haulers refused to take the liability risk. Dr. Chen paced the shelter office like a caged animal herself, making call after call to find someone willing to help. "We can't just leave him here to drown," she said, her voice cracking with exhaustion and desperation. Jake's decision was immediate and uncompromising. "Then we don't leave." He'd weathered storms before, both literal and figurative, and he wasn't about to abandon Thunder when the bull needed him most. His military training had taught him that sometimes the most dangerous option was also the only honorable one. "I'll stay with him. If something happens, at least he won't die alone." Dot Henderson's response was equally characteristic. "If you boys think I'm heading to some stuffy evacuation center while Thunder's fighting for his life, you've got another think coming." At 72, she'd survived tornadoes, ice storms, and the death of everyone she'd ever loved. One more hurricane wasn't going to scare her away from what might be her last chance to make a difference. "Doctor." Chen initially protested their decision, citing safety protocols and liability concerns, but she knew in her heart that evacuating would mean abandoning Thunder to certain death. The storm would arrive before the scheduled execution, but the flooding and power outages would make a humane euthanasia impossible. Thunder would either drown in his pen or die slowly from exposure and terror. "God help us all," she whispered, then began preparing the shelter for siege conditions. The storm's approach created an eerie atmosphere throughout Millbrook County. Most residents had heeded evacuation orders, leaving behind a ghost town of boarded windows and empty streets. The few who remained were either too stubborn, too poor, or too committed to something they couldn't abandon. At the shelter, this small group of humans and one massive bull prepared to face nature's fury together. Thunder seemed to sense the approaching danger in ways that human meteorology couldn't quite explain. His behavior changed as the barometric pressure dropped, becoming restless and alert in a way that reminded Jake of military working animals before combat operations. The bull positioned himself differently in his pen, always maintaining clear sight lines to the humans who had chosen to stay with him. His intelligence was evident in every calculated movement. As the outer bands of Hurricane Delilah reached Millbrook County, the wind began to howl with increasing intensity. Rain lashed against the shelter's metal roof with the sound of machine gun fire, while the building itself seemed to flex and groan under the atmospheric pressure. The power went out at 3:47 p.m., plunging them into a dim twilight broken only by battery-powered emergency lights that cast dancing shadows on the concrete walls. The real crisis began when the storm surge, pushed inland by hurricane-force winds, overwhelmed the county's aging drainage system. Water began seeping under doors and through foundation cracks, slowly at first, then with increasing urgency as the storm intensified. Within 2 hours, the shelter floor was covered with 6 inches of muddy water that rose steadily with each passing minute. Thunder's pen, located in the lowest part of the facility, became a trap. The water rose around his massive hooves, then to his ankles, then higher still. Jake and the others worked frantically to open drainage channels and redirect the flow, but they were fighting the combined force of nature and inadequate infrastructure. The bull watched their efforts with an intelligence that was both comforting and heartbreaking. He understood the danger, but he also understood that these humans were risking everything for him. The emergency radio crackled with reports of flash flooding throughout the county. Millbrook Elementary School, the same building where Billy Morrison had attended kindergarten, was serving as a makeshift rescue center for residents trapped by rapidly rising water. The irony wasn't lost on anyone listening. The school associated with Thunder's supposed victim was now sheltering people whose lives might soon depend on the same bull everyone wanted dead. At 8:30 p.m., with water levels approaching Thunder's belly, Jake made a decision that went against every safety protocol he'd ever learned. He opened Thunder's pen, giving the bull freedom to move to higher ground within the shelter. Dr. Chen gasped at the apparent recklessness, but Jake's military experience with working animals had taught him to trust their instincts in crisis situations. Thunder's response was immediate and profound. Instead of fleeing or becoming agitated, he moved purposefully toward the shelter's main entrance, where the water was shallowest. More importantly, he positioned himself between the rising water and the area where Jake, Dot, and Dr. Chen had taken refuge. His massive body became a living breakwater, using his weight and size to redirect the flow of incoming floodwater. The sight of a 2,200-pound bull deliberately shielding 3 humans from Hurricane Delilah's fury was both terrifying and magnificent. Thunder stood motionless for hours, his muscles straining against the current, water swirling around his massive frame as he served as a barrier between the storm and the people who had refused to abandon him. The symbolism was lost on no one. The supposed killer was now the protector. Outside, the storm raged with biblical intensity. Trees that had stood for decades were uprooted and hurled like matchsticks. Cars floated down what had been streets just hours before. The county's emergency services were overwhelmed, with rescue teams trapped in staging areas by impassable roads and communication systems failing under the storm's assault. Inside the shelter, a different kind of drama was unfolding. Tommy Caldwell had somehow escaped the mandatory evacuation and made his way to the facility on foot, arriving soaked and shivering just as the worst of the storm surge hit. His presence created both joy and terror. Joy at seeing Thunder again. Terror at realizing a 9-year-old child was now trapped with them in a flooding building during a Category 2 hurricane. Dr. Chen tried to radio for emergency evacuation for Tommy, but the communication systems were down. The boy's appearance also raised troubling questions about his father's whereabouts and why Tommy had been so desperate to reach Thunder that he would risk his life in a hurricane. "He needed me," Tommy explained simply, wrapping his small arms around Thunder's massive leg. "He's scared of storms." The water continued to rise throughout the night, reaching levels that threatened everyone's survival. Thunder's positioning became increasingly critical as the flood turned deadly. His body mass and strength allowed him to maintain his protective stance even as the current grew stronger. But the physical toll was evident in his labored breathing and the strain visible in every muscle. He was literally holding back a hurricane to protect the humans who had shown him kindness. As dawn approached, the storm's eye passed directly over Millbrook County, creating an eerie calm that felt more ominous than the hurricane itself. In that strange quiet, with water still rising and rescue seemingly impossible, the small group huddled around Thunder faced the very real possibility that their decision to stay might have doomed them all. The bull that everyone had wanted dead might be their only hope for survival, or he might die alongside them in a flood that would forever change how the community remembered both Billy Morrison's tragedy and Thunder's story. The irony was inescapable. Thunder, sentenced to death for allegedly taking one child's life, was now risking everything to save the life of another child, along with the adults who had believed in his innocence when no one else would. The water reached Thunder's chest by dawn, and his massive legs began to tremble from exhaustion. For 8 hours the bull had stood like a living dam against Hurricane Delilah's fury, but even 2,200 pounds of determination had limits. Jake watched in horror as Thunder's breathing became labored, his great head drooping with fatigue that threatened to become fatal collapse. "He's dying," Dr. Chen whispered, her veterinary training recognizing the signs of hypothermia and exhaustion that were claiming Thunder despite his heroic efforts. The floodwater was cold, sapping his strength with each passing hour, while the physical strain of resisting the current had pushed his massive frame beyond its limits. His amber eyes, once bright with intelligence and hope, were growing dim with approaching death. Tommy Caldwell clung to Thunder's neck, his small body pressed against the bull's warm hide, as if his presence alone could transfer life force to his dying protector. "Don't leave me!" the boy sobbed, his tears mixing with the filthy floodwater that continued to rise around them. "Please don't leave me like everyone else does." The child's words cut through the adults' hearts like shattered glass, revealing depths of abandonment that no 9-year-old should carry. Dot Henderson's arthritis screamed in protest as she struggled through the chest-deep water to reach Thunder's side. At 72, she had no business being in a flood zone during a hurricane, but love had never been reasonable. "You hold on, you beautiful boy," she commanded Thunder with the same voice she'd once used to convince reluctant students that they could overcome impossible odds. "You've got too much living left to do to give up now." The emergency radio crackled with desperate reports from across Millbrook County. The elementary school that had been serving as an evacuation center was now surrounded by floodwater, trapping 43 residents, including 12 children, on the second floor. Rescue boats couldn't navigate the debris-filled streets, and helicopters were grounded by winds that still gusted over 60 miles per hour. The community that had gathered to watch Thunder's execution was now fighting for its own survival. Jake felt his own strength failing as he tried to support Thunder's massive weight. His wheelchair had long since been abandoned to the flood, leaving him struggling to stay afloat while helping the bull who had saved them all. Military training had prepared him for many things, but not for watching a hero die in his arms while a child begged for mercy from a God who seemed to have turned away from East Texas entirely. Thunder's collapse came suddenly and without warning. One moment he was standing, trembling but resolute, and the next his legs buckled beneath him. And the bull's massive body hit the water with a splash that sent waves across the flooded shelter, and suddenly the barrier that had protected them was gone. Water surged through the space Thunder had guarded, threatening to sweep them all away in the chaotic current. "No!" Tommy screamed, throwing himself across Thunder's submerged head in a desperate attempt to keep the bull's nostrils above water. The boy's small hands frantically cleared debris from Thunder's mouth and nose, while Jake and Dr. Chen struggled to position the bull's head on higher ground. But Thunder's weight made it impossible. They simply didn't have the strength to lift 2,200 pounds of unconscious animal. The water level reached a critical point where even the adults could barely keep their heads above the surface. Dot Henderson, weakened by age and cold, began to lose her battle against the current. "Doctor." Chen lunged to catch her as the elderly woman's strength gave out, but the veterinarian's own reserves were nearly depleted. They were all drowning together in the place where Thunder had made his last stand. In that moment of absolute despair, when death seemed certain for all of them, Thunder's eyes opened. The massive bull's survival instincts kicked in with a surge of adrenaline that lifted his head above water just long enough for one last act of protection. With Tommy still clinging to his neck, Thunder used the final reserves of his strength to push the boy toward the highest point in the shelter, a concrete platform that might keep him above the rising water for a few more precious minutes. The gesture cost Thunder everything. The effort of lifting Tommy to safety drained the last of his life force, and the great bull's head sank beneath the muddy floodwater for what everyone believed would be the final time. His amber eyes closed as water filled his lungs, and his massive body went completely still in the grip of hypothermic shock that mimicked death itself. Tommy's screams echoed through the flooded shelter as he watched his protector disappear beneath the surface. The boy dove repeatedly into the murky water, trying to reach Thunder's submerged head, but Jake caught him before the current could claim another victim. "He's gone, son," Jake said through his own tears, holding the sobbing child as tightly as his weakened arms allowed. "Thunder's gone." Dr. Chen pressed her ear to Thunder's exposed flank, listening desperately for any sign of life. For long minutes, she heard nothing but the sound of rushing water and her own ragged breathing. Thunder's massive form floated motionless, his weight distributed by the flood that had finally claimed him. The bull, who had survived 3 tours in Afghanistan, abuse at the hands of humans who should have protected him, and months of imprisonment while facing execution, had died saving the very people who had once condemned him. The rescue helicopters found them 2 hours later when the storm surge finally began to recede. Emergency crews pulled 4 survivors from the flooded shelter: Jake Matthews, Dr. Sarah Chen, Dorothy Henderson, and Tommy Caldwell, all clinging to life on the concrete platform where Thunder had placed them with his final act of heroism. The massive bull's body lay motionless in the receding water, his black hide marked by cuts and bruises from debris that had battered him throughout the night. The paramedics worked frantically to stabilize the survivors, wrapping them in thermal blankets and administering IV fluids to combat hypothermia and dehydration. Tommy refused to leave Thunder's side, his small hands patting the bull's still flank, while he whispered promises that they would be together again someday. The image of a 9-year-old boy mourning his protector became the defining photograph of Hurricane Delilah's devastation, a picture that would appear on magazine covers and internet memes, forever linking Thunder's sacrifice to the power of love that transcends species. As the helicopter lifted off from the flooded shelter, carrying the survivors to safety, Jake looked down at Thunder's motionless form, growing smaller below them. The bull, who had been sentenced to death, had instead chosen to die saving others, transforming from villain to hero in his final hours. The execution scheduled for that morning had become unnecessary. Hurricane Delilah had claimed Thunder's life in a way that no one could question or condemn. The community that had been divided over Thunder's fate would now have to reckon with a different kind of loss, the death of someone who had proven his worth through ultimate sacrifice, dying not as the monster they had imagined, but as the protector he had always been. The miracle began with a single, shuddering breath that no one should have been able to take. Dr. Marcus Webb, the emergency veterinarian airlifted in from Houston, pressed his stethoscope against Thunder's massive ribcage and heard the impossible. A faint, irregular heartbeat that defied every law of medicine and logic. The bull had been underwater for nearly 20 minutes. His body temperature dropped to levels that should have meant brain death, yet somehow life persisted in his enormous frame. "Get me epinephrine, IV fluids, and warming blankets now," Dr. Webb shouted to his team as they worked frantically around Thunder's motionless body on the makeshift veterinary table they'd constructed from sawhorses and plywood. The bull's chances were microscopic. Animals Thunder's size simply didn't survive prolonged submersion and hypothermic shock. But the veterinarian had learned never to underestimate the will to live, especially in animals who had something to live for. The resuscitation efforts drew crowds that defied evacuation orders and flood warnings. Word spread through social media faster than the storm surge had spread through Millbrook County, and people began arriving from across Texas to witness what many were calling a modern resurrection. The hashtag Thunder Miracle hashtag exploded across platforms as live streams showed the massive bull fighting for each breath while medical equipment beeped and hummed around his prone form. Tommy Caldwell refused to leave Thunder's side, his small hand resting on the bull's massive head as if his touch could transfer life force between them. The boy had barely spoken since the rescue, responding to questions with nods or shakes of his head, but his vigil beside Thunder was absolute. "He waited for me," Tommy finally whispered to Jake, who had been moved to a wheelchair beside the improvised operating table. "He held on until I was safe, just like he did with Billy." The mention of Billy Morrison sent shock waves through the assembled crowd. Dr. Chen, still recovering from her own hypothermia but refusing to rest, looked up sharply at Tommy's words. "What do you mean, just like with Billy?" she asked gently, her veterinarian's intuition sensing that the truth was finally about to emerge. Tommy's response would change everything they thought they knew about the tragedy that had condemned Thunder. "Billy was drowning," Tommy said, his voice so quiet that adults had to lean close to hear him. "In the pond behind our house. Thunder jumped in and pushed him to the shore, but Billy hit his head on the rocks. Thunder was trying to wake him up when Daddy found them." The child's words fell like hammer blows on the assembled crowd, each sentence destroying months of assumptions and condemnation. "Doctor." Caldwell arrived at that moment, pushing through the crowd with the frantic energy of a man whose carefully constructed lies were crumbling around him. His face was pale, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled from the storm and something else, the look of someone whose sins were finally catching up with him. "Tommy, don't say things you don't understand," he warned, but his voice lacked conviction. "I understand everything, Daddy," Tommy replied with the devastating honesty of childhood. "Thunder didn't hurt Billy. Thunder tried to save Billy just like he saved us from the flood. But you told everyone Thunder was bad because you were scared they'd blame you for not watching us better." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a house fire, impossible to ignore or deny. Jake's military training had taught him to recognize the moment when an enemy's defenses finally collapsed. Dr. Caldwell's shoulders sagged as the weight of truth became too heavy to carry alone. "I was inside making phone calls," he admitted, his voice breaking. "The boys were playing by the pond. I should have been watching them. When I found Billy, he was already—" The confession trailed off, but its implications were crystal clear. The security footage that Dr. Caldwell had claimed was damaged emerged from his own phone, backed up automatically to cloud storage he had forgotten existed. The video showed exactly what Tommy had described. Thunder pulling Billy from the pond, frantically trying to revive the unconscious child, standing guard over his body until help arrived. The bull's supposed attack was actually a desperate rescue attempt, misinterpreted by a father consumed with guilt and fear of liability. As the truth spread through the crowd and across social media, Thunder's vital signs began to stabilize. His breathing grew stronger, his heart rate steadied, and his body temperature slowly climbed toward normal ranges. Doctor. Webb couldn't explain the correlation, but he'd seen similar phenomena in human patients. The will to live seemed to strengthen when patients felt their suffering had meaning and purpose. The community's transformation was as dramatic as Thunder's physical recovery. People who had demanded the bull's execution just days before now wept openly as they watched him fight for life. The Morrison family, devastated by the revelation that their son's death had been a tragic accident rather than a vicious attack, faced the horrible knowledge that their quest for justice had nearly claimed the life of Billy's would-be savior. Dot Henderson, despite her own exhaustion and hypothermia, organized a round-the-clock vigil that drew volunteers from across the state. Her trailer became command central for coordinating supplies, medical equipment, and emotional support for everyone involved in Thunder's recovery. "That bull saved my life," she told reporters. "The least I can do is help save his." The legal implications were staggering. Dr. Caldwell faced charges ranging from filing false reports to child endangerment, while the county confronted massive liability for nearly executing an innocent animal based on fabricated evidence. Insurance companies scrambled to assess damages, while lawyers filed motions that would take years to resolve. But the immediate focus remained on Thunder's recovery and the healing of a community torn apart by deception. Thunder's awakening came gradually, like sunrise after the longest night. His amber eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then sharpening as he recognized the faces gathered around him. Tommy's was the first he saw, and the massive bull's head lifted slightly in what could only be interpreted as recognition and affection. The moment was captured by dozens of cameras and would become one of the most shared images in social media history. The bull's first attempts to stand were unsuccessful, his massive frame weakened by trauma and medication. But his determination was evident in every effort, fueled by the presence of the humans who had refused to abandon him. Jake worked with veterinary physical therapists to design exercises that would help Thunder regain his strength, drawing on his experience with military working animals recovering from combat injuries. The financial support that poured in exceeded everyone's wildest expectations. Corporate sponsors, celebrity donors, and ordinary people moved by Thunder's story contributed over $2 million to his care and recovery. The funds would ensure not only Thunder's rehabilitation, but also the establishment of a sanctuary for other misunderstood animals facing similar fates. Dr. Caldwell's public confession, delivered through tears at a hastily arranged press conference, completed Thunder's transformation from villain to hero. "Thunder is innocent," he said, flanked by lawyers who couldn't prevent their client from destroying his own defense. "He tried to save Billy, and I was too afraid and ashamed to tell the truth. I let an innocent animal suffer for my failures as a father and as a man." The revelation triggered a broader conversation about rush to judgment in the age of social media, about the complex relationships between humans and animals, and about the courage required to admit mistakes even when the consequences are severe. Thunder had become a symbol not just of animal intelligence and loyalty, but of the possibility for redemption and second chances in a world quick to condemn and slow to forgive. As Thunder grew stronger, his personality began to emerge from the trauma that had nearly claimed his life. His gentleness with children became legendary. His intelligence in navigating complex situations impressed animal behaviorists, and his bond with Jake deepened into something approaching telepathy. The bull, who had once been scheduled for execution, was now being studied by researchers hoping to understand the depths of animal consciousness and emotional capacity. The truth about Billy Morrison's death brought closure to some wounds while opening others. The boy's family struggled with grief compounded by the knowledge that their campaign for justice had been based on a lie, while Dr. Caldwell faced not only legal consequences but the loss of his veterinary license and his reputation. Tommy was placed in protective custody while social services evaluated his home situation, but his daily visits with Thunder continued as a crucial part of his emotional healing. The community that had been divided by Thunder's case found itself united in a different way, bound together by shared shame, shared wonder, and shared determination to ensure that such a miscarriage of justice never happened again. 1 year after Hurricane Delilah nearly claimed his life, Thunder stood in golden sunlight beneath the sprawling oak tree that had become the heart of what everyone now called Thunder's Haven. The 320-acre sanctuary in East Texas had transformed from abandoned farmland into a refuge for misunderstood animals and broken spirits, funded by the millions of dollars donated by people who believed in second chances and the power of redemption. Jake Matthews pushed his wheelchair across the specially designed pathways that wound through the property, his daily inspection routine bringing him past the various paddocks where rescued animals grazed in peaceful contentment. His own transformation was as remarkable as Thunder's. The nightmares that had plagued him for years had given way to dreams of the future, of the lives they were saving together, of the family they had built from the wreckage of their separate traumas. Tommy Caldwell, now 10 years old and officially Jake's foster son, sat cross-legged in the grass reading to Thunder from a book about military working animals. The boy's voice had grown stronger over the past year, his confidence blooming under the steady love of Jake and Dot and the unwavering protection of the bull who had risked everything to save him. The legal proceedings had been finalized 3 months ago. Dr. Caldwell had signed away his parental rights from his prison cell, recognizing that his son deserved better than a father consumed by guilt and self-destruction. "Listen to this part, Thunder," Tommy said, his finger tracing the words as he read about bomb detection animals in Afghanistan. "It says here that military bulls saved over 300 lives during Operation Enduring Freedom. That's like you, isn't it? You saved people before you came to live with us." Thunder's massive head lowered to nuzzle the boy's shoulder, a gesture of affection that never failed to draw visitors to tears. Dot Henderson emerged from the farmhouse kitchen, her arms laden with fresh-baked cookies that filled the air with the scent of cinnamon and home. At 73, she had found new purpose in her role as unofficial grandmother to Tommy and den mother to the steady stream of visitors who came seeking healing at Thunder's Haven. Her arthritis still pained her, but the joy of watching broken things mend had proven to be better medicine than anything doctors could prescribe. "Got a bus full of veterans coming this afternoon," she announced, settling into the wooden rocker Jake had built for her beneath the oak tree. 27 of them from the VA hospital in Houston. Dr. Chen says Thunder's therapeutic work is the most successful program she's ever documented. The bull's ability to sense emotional distress and provide comfort had made him a sought-after therapy partner for veterans struggling with PTSD, grieving families, and children who had experienced trauma. The transformation of Thunder from condemned killer to celebrated healer had attracted attention from around the world. Animal behaviorists came to study his intelligence and emotional capacity. Documentary filmmakers recorded his daily interactions with humans and other animals. Celebrity visitors posed for photographs that appeared in magazines and spread across social media, keeping Thunder's story alive in the public consciousness. But the most meaningful changes were the quiet ones that happened away from cameras and crowds. Thunder's bond with Jake had evolved into something approaching telepathy. The bull could sense his partner's emotions and needs with uncanny accuracy, positioning himself to provide comfort during difficult moments or alerting others when Jake's medication schedule was forgotten. Their partnership had become a model for human-animal relationships that transcended the traditional boundaries between species. The other animals at Thunder's Haven had their own stories of redemption and recovery. There was Belle, a retired military working dog whose handler had died in combat, leaving her unable to trust new humans until Thunder's gentle presence helped her heal. Marcus, an elderly horse abandoned by owners who could no longer afford his care, had found new purpose as a therapy partner for disabled children. Each animal had been written off by someone, somewhere, until Thunder's Haven gave them a second chance. Tommy's artwork now covered the walls of the visitor center, his drawings having evolved from dark depictions of fear and isolation to bright scenes of animals and humans living in harmony. His latest series depicted Thunder as a guardian angel watching over the sanctuary, wings spread wide to protect all the creatures under his care. The boy's talent had attracted attention from art teachers and child psychologists who marveled at his ability to process trauma through creative expression. The legal battles surrounding Thunder's case had ended with justice served, though not in the way anyone had expected. Dr. Caldwell was serving a 5-year sentence for fraud, perjury, and child endangerment, his veterinary license permanently revoked. The settlement with the Morrison family had funded a scholarship program for veterinary students specializing in animal behavioral therapy. The county had restructured its animal control policies to prevent future miscarriages of justice. The financial success of Thunder's Haven had exceeded everyone's projections. Corporate sponsors lined up to associate their brands with the sanctuary's message of redemption and second chances. A best-selling book about Thunder's story had been optioned for a major motion picture. Merchandise featuring Thunder's image raised funds for other animal rescue organizations across the country. But Jake insisted that all decisions be made with Thunder's well-being as the primary consideration. Fame and fortune were acceptable only if they served the mission of helping other animals and people in need. The therapeutic programs at Thunder's Haven had expanded to include grief counseling for families who had lost loved ones, support groups for veterans dealing with PTSD, and educational initiatives that taught children about empathy and the importance of looking beyond surface appearances to see the truth underneath. Thunder's story had become a parable for modern times, a reminder that judgment should be tempered with wisdom and that redemption was always possible for those willing to seek it. Tommy's relationship with his biological father remained complicated. Dr. Caldwell wrote letters from prison expressing remorse and asking for forgiveness that his son wasn't ready to give. Jake and Dot had helped Tommy understand that healing couldn't be rushed, that some wounds required time and patience to mend properly. The boy visited his father twice a year, supervised meetings that slowly rebuilt trust while maintaining the healthy boundaries necessary for Tommy's continued recovery. The afternoon veterans visit proceeded with the quiet efficiency that had made Thunder's Haven famous among therapeutic communities. Thunder moved among the wheelchair-bound soldiers with infinite patience, seeming to understand intuitively which individuals needed gentle contact and which required respectful distance. His presence allowed hardened warriors to access emotions they had buried for years, facilitating healing that traditional therapy had been unable to achieve. Jake watched from his wheelchair as Thunder worked, marveling at the bull's capacity for emotional intelligence. The animal that had once been condemned as a mindless killer was actually one of the most empathetic creatures Jake had ever encountered. Thunder's ability to read human emotions and respond appropriately had made him invaluable to the therapeutic programs, but it was his capacity for forgiveness that truly set him apart. As sunset painted the Texas sky in shades of gold and crimson, the daily routine at Thunder's Haven wound down toward evening. Tommy completed his homework under Dot's watchful eye while Jake reviewed applications from other rescue organizations seeking advice on animal rehabilitation. Thunder grazed peacefully in his favorite paddock, his massive form silhouetted against the dying light like a monument to resilience and hope. The dinner conversation that evening, as it had every night for the past year, included plans for tomorrow's activities and reflections on the day's successes and challenges. Tommy talked about his upcoming school presentation on military working animals. Dot shared gossip from her volunteer work at the local food bank, and Jake discussed the architectural plans for expanding the visitor center to accommodate growing demand. Thunder's presence at these family meals had become so natural that visitors were often surprised to realize they were dining with a 200-pound bull. He lay peacefully beside the table, occasionally accepting offered vegetables from Tommy's plate. his gentle breathing a constant reminder of how close they had all come to losing everything. The bull, who had once been scheduled for execution, had become the cornerstone of a family that defied conventional definitions but worked better than most traditional arrangements. As the evening deepened and stars appeared in the clear Texas sky, Jake reflected on the journey that had brought them all together. A year ago, he had been a broken veteran seeking purpose in the adoption of an unwanted animal. Tonight, he was the father of a thriving boy, the partner of a remarkable bull, and the caretaker of a sanctuary that had touched thousands of lives. The transformation seemed impossible, but the evidence surrounded him in the form of healing hearts and second chances made manifest. Thunder's story had taught them all that redemption was not just possible but inevitable for those brave enough to see past fear to the truth underneath. Sometimes the most hated became the most beloved, and sometimes the greatest love stories were between the most unlikely partners. In a world quick to condemn and slow to forgive, Thunder's Haven stood as proof that grace could triumph over judgment, that love could heal the deepest wounds, and that family could be found in the most unexpected places. Sometimes, life teaches us that the most beautiful endings come from the most broken beginnings. Thunder's story reminds us that at any age, we can still choose love over fear, hope over despair. Like many of us who've weathered life's storms, lost spouses, watched children move away, felt forgotten by a world that seems to value youth over wisdom, Thunder knew what it meant to be misunderstood and cast aside. But Jake, Dot, and Tommy showed us that family isn't about blood or age. It's about showing up when it matters most. At Thunder's Haven, a 72-year-old widow found purpose in her golden years. A disabled veteran discovered that his greatest battles could lead to his greatest victories. And a traumatized child learned that love really can conquer fear. Their unconventional family proves that our most meaningful chapters might still be unwritten, that second chances aren't just for the young, and that sometimes the thing everyone's afraid of is exactly what everyone needs. Thunder didn't need fixing, he needed understanding. Maybe we all do. Your story isn't over. It might just be getting to the good part. Have you ever found family in unexpected places? What second chance changed your life forever? Share your story below. We need to hear it.